Hello and welcome to the recorded version of the Tutor training. We offer live tutor training at WSU on the Spokane campus twice every semester, but often students aren't available during those times, and so this is another way for you to get that information. The recorded version, of course, is not as interactive as the live training, but it will at least give you a basic foundation for some skills to be a good tutor, to be an effective tutor. I will move through this a little bit quicker. There are a few materials that you'll want to have available. They were located in the same folder with this PowerPoint presentation on Blackboard. So you want to either have those up on the computer or print it out. There were some case studies and a few handouts that you'll find useful as we move through this. And I am going to move quickly, so feel free to pause if you need to and take notes. First, just a little information about me. My name's Tara Lassard. I'm the Learning and Career Specialist at the WSU on the Spokane campus. I work with students one-on-one to develop individualized learning strategies and to improve their time management. So feel free to refer students to me if they could use some help with any of those things. I also provide career support, so that's assistance with job application processes, developing a resume or CV, and practicing interviewing. We're going to skip introductions since this is a recorded version. Here is what we're going to do during this recorded session. First, we'll briefly discuss what your role is as a tutor, and then we'll go over some specific skills for tutoring. Structuring tutoring, what that looks like one-on-one versus in a group. Bloom's taxonomy and Maslow's hierarchies are different ways to assess where the student is at in the learning process. We'll talk about that. Metacognitive learning strategies are specific methods to move students beyond where they're at in the learning process to the next level. Socratic questioning is how you do that in a positive and in challenging way. And then we'll talk briefly about test preparation and test anxiety. Although you're not expected to have to do a lot of that work in tutoring, it does come up now and again, so I'm going to give you some basic things to be thinking about and then refer students to me if they need assistance. And then last, there's some opportunities for you to practice applying these skills using case studies, which I mentioned earlier are on a separate Word document. A few housekeeping items that are still relevant, even though this is a recorded training. It probably will not be 2 hours. It will probably be shorter. If you have questions, please jot them down and send them to me by email, stop by my office, or call me, and all my contact information is on one of the final slides. And then as a reminder, this is paid training, and so this should be included. The time that you spend with this PowerPoint presentation should be included on your timesheet. So the first learning outcome of the 3 that we're going to go over today is understanding your role as a tutor. Many students, when asked what is your job description as a tutor, they think that it's just an extension of the instructor or the teacher. But tutoring is really very different than teaching. Tutoring is being on the sidelines, like being a coach. Tutoring is providing resources, encouragement, support, content information, and guiding the student through levels of understanding, which is very different from being a content expert with all of the answers. And I think this is an important thing to cover because a lot of tutors feel like they're supposed to have all of the answers. We hired you because you have good people skills, because you did well in the course, and we know that overall you're a strong student. But really, you're not expected to be an expert in any particular subject. You're just expected to have a familiarity with it and then to use the tools that you will pick up in this training to be a good coach. So imagine yourself providing resources, guidance, strategies, support on the sidelines, but you're not the player, you're not the one who's taking the test and earning that A grade, or you're not the one responsible for that F grade if the student doesn't do as well as they had hoped. There's also an image on this slide of scaffolding, and scaffolding is something that we put up around buildings to provide safety and support, and that's another role that you have as a tutor, is to provide a safe space for students to talk about the learning that they're struggling with, and also providing that support system. So what sort of resources did you use when you were getting through that class that were helpful for you, or what resources do you know are available on the campus that you can help connect the student to? So in your mind, as you start to think about your role as a tutor, I want you to take any sort of idea in your mind that you have to have all of the answers and be a content expert, and I want you to put those away and replace those with a picture of you as a coach or scaffolding around the student. So these are the tools that we're going to talk about. This will be the bulk of our session today. We're going to talk about 4 different tools. There are many tools for being an effective tutor, but given the time we have available, I think these are the 4 most important for you to learn about first. The first tool is providing structure. It is your responsibility as a tutor to provide structure to either an individualized tutoring session or a group tutoring session. We'll talk about what that looks like and how you do that. Assessing where the student is at is so important because you have to walk through somebody else's door before you can walk them through your door. It's this concept of meeting someone where they're at. In the medical field, if you imagine a physician coming in and telling a low-income immigrant who's learning English still a number of different test results and a prescription of lifestyle changes and referrals to other sources in the community, other resources in the community, and this physician just sort of gives all of this information to the patient and then leaves, that's an example of not meeting somebody where they're at. An example of meeting somebody where they're at would be that physician then adjusting their messaging and adjusting the language they use to not necessarily be the language that they use among their peers, but to be something that was more understandable for the general population and simplified for someone who's still learning English and learning a culture. So that would be an example of meeting that person where they're at and helping them to get still the resources they need. How do you meet somebody where they're at if you don't know where they're at? We're going to talk about 2 different ways that you can help assess where a student is. That will be Bloom's taxonomy and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The third tool we'll discuss are specific metacognitive learning strategies. These are strategies that help students to develop critical thinking skills, and we're just going to go over 3 of them, or 4. We go over 4 of them today. There are many, but I'm going to give you a few to start, and then you can come meet with me if you'd like more information on that. And then the last tool we'll discuss is using the Socratic questioning technique, and this is just a way by which we can question people to help guide them into creating deeper levels of knowledge and more critical thinking skills. So that's what the bulk of our time is going to go over today. Is these, we'll cover these 4 tools for your tutoring toolbox. Okay, the first one was providing structure. And structure looks a little different if you have a one-on-one session versus if you have a group that you're tutoring with. We'll go over individual one-on-one first, and then we'll talk about group tutoring. There is a handout for this available in the same folder as this workshop was posted in Blackboard. So there's really 4 sections to the structure of a tutoring session, and the bulk of it happens in the work session, but let's talk about all 4. The first is going to be just your opening. This is when you greet somebody and say, you know, how was your weekend, or how are you doing today? Just sort of a couple of minutes to establish rapport and check in. And you're paying attention to, you know, how they appear and how motivated they seem to be, and, you know, just some of their characteristics. Are they ready to learn today? And then you might ask the question, what would you like to focus on today? Or what is most important that we cover? So you're just getting an idea of where they're at and what they need. And then you reiterate back to them the goals that you heard them share with you. It sounds like it's most important that you want to become more confident in this particular topic. Is that right? What else is important that we cover today? And that what else question is really key. That's how you get at things that you might otherwise miss. So you set goals. This whole opening and setting goals thing shouldn't take more than 5 or 7 minutes. And then you get into the work. And this is where you'll spend the bulk of your one-on-one tutoring session. And this is where you're going to use the tools that we talk about next. So you're going to try to assess where the student's at so you can meet them there. You'll be the coach, build that scaffolding around the student, introduce tools and resources, use that Socratic questioning, lots of good listening. So you should be speaking less than you're listening when you're in a tutoring relationship, asking really good questions, pausing, waiting, being comfortable with that silence so that the student has time to think and process and respond and realize what they need to know. So really asking good questions and being comfortable with the silence, listening to what the student is saying, and letting that guide the rest of your session. You'll bring in additional maybe online resources that you found helpful when you were learning this topic. You may ask other tutors if you're in an environment where there's other tutors around to help fill in some blanks. You may coach the student through how to ask their instructor some information about content that you may not be familiar with. So that's where you're spending most of your time. If it's a 1-hour tutoring session, I would say 45 to 50 minutes is spent here with the work. And then the closing is your opportunity to just reflect on the work the student did, be encouraging, and then talk about what's next. So an example would be, hey, this was a really good session. It sounds like you have a greater understanding of this concept and you worked really hard at it. So nice job. And I hope that we can meet again next week because you mentioned that you have a test coming up. Maybe we can dig a little deeper on some of those topics. So that's what a closing would look like. And that's the structure of a tutoring session. And this is really the kind of structure you would see even if you were getting together with a friend for coffee. You kind of have that general opening and what's been going on in their life, and then you spend the bulk of it usually talking about some major things that are happening in each other's lives. And then you close it out with, hey, let me know how you're doing, right? So this is just a same sort of lens, but taking it and applying it to tutoring. Now, how do you provide support in a group environment? And this is trickier. I think it takes a little more practice to feel confident in, see if I can move my video image around a little bit here. Guess not. Okay, so it takes a little bit more practice to feel confident in leading groups in tutoring, but really the structure is much the same. So you kick it off by making sure that everybody feels a sense of belonging and by determining what the needs are of the group. So you announce, hey, let's get started. Really glad everybody's here today. I'd like us to all gather around for a minute. Just go around the table and share something that you want to be sure you get out of today's group tutoring session. So that's one way to kick it off. Really anything that gets everybody involved and gives everybody an opportunity to share what they need would work. And then you start to set the stage. So this is sort of similar to setting goals, but you're doing it in a group session. So you really need to provide a lot of leadership when you're setting the stage with a group. You need to be sure that everybody is given an opportunity to participate, because naturally you'll have some people who will dominate groups. And then you need to provide direction about what they're going to do during this part of the group's time together. So an example would be that you reflect back, hey, I'm hearing that everybody really wants to focus on this particular topic today, and I heard so-and-so mention this and so-and-so mention this, so I want to be sure we have time to get to those topics as well. I'm going to recommend that you break up into groups of 3 and that everybody focuses on, or that this group focuses on this subtopic, this group focuses on this topic, and then in 30 minutes, let's all come back together and share what we learned. So that's one example of how you could break up the groups, have them work in maybe smaller groups together with a specific goal in mind, so you're providing that leadership, and then bring it together so that you're sharing ideas with the whole group. And then be sure that you're spending a little time at the end going around to each person, or some of those people who might have mentioned outlier topics that they wanted covered. Be sure that they're getting their needs met as well. And you might, during these breakout groups, you might walk up to each group, check in with them, see how they're doing, provide some resources or support, and ask some really good questions that challenge them. Like maybe they're working out a particular problem and they've got it figured out, then throw a wrench in it and say, well, let's say that this particular case study, instead of it being a 70-year-old male, it's a 9-year-old female. How would you handle this differently when we change those parameters? So just providing support and encouragement, but also challenging students. And then once you get to the end, you might have some rowdiness going on. Usually people start to develop rapport, and they might even get off topic now and again, so you'll have to bring them back. But wrap things up. Make sure you show gratitude, encouragement. Hey, everybody worked really hard today. I was really glad to see the turnout, and I think you made some good progress. I hope everybody comes back again next week, and I'm going to hang out for the next 5 minutes. If you have any other questions for me, go ahead and come up. Really, it's very similar to the one-on-one. It's just a little bit more leadership and direction on your part with a group. All right, so that was tool number 1. That was looking at how do you structure the tutoring session. So our second tool is about assessing where the student is at, because as we've talked about, how do you meet them where they're at if you don't know? Many of you who are watching this video probably have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's very common in the health sciences to talk about this. And this is one assessment tool that you would use. You're not necessarily going to ask questions to find out where the student's at. You're not trying to diagnose the student. You're just trying to figure out where they are at on this hierarchy could affect their learning. So, for example, if a student says to you that their lease is running out soon, and they don't know where they're going to be living in 2 weeks, and that's stressing them out, you can assess that on Maslow's level of needs, that both their physiological and safety needs are at risk right now. So if those things are at risk, it's going to be more difficult for the student to focus on studying. Really, that sense of safety and physiological needs being met are baseline needs in order to be able to focus on learning. So there's other things that might come up in one-on-one relationships or one-on-one tutoring as well, where you'll learn that some of these needs are not being met. And it's not your job to try and make them met. It's just your job to be flexible with the student if they seem to be slower to pick things up. If you are aware of resources that can help the student, by all means connect them or talk with one of us in the Student Success Center so we can help reach out to that student and help them find the resources they need. Maslow also had a levels of learning theory, which is not as widely known as his hierarchy of needs. But I do want to discuss this at least briefly. So it moves from unconscious incompetence. This is where you don't know what you don't know, something that you've never heard of before and don't even know that you need to know about. Moving up to conscious incompetence, and this is usually where we are at when we step foot in a classroom for the first time. We realize we don't know anything about this topic, but we need to. And then you move to conscious competence, and this is where you start to feel some confidence around your understanding of the topic, all the way to unconscious competence, where it's just so natural to you that you are on autopilot. It's like, if you've been driving a car for a long time, you can get in the car and drive somewhere without having to focus much on how the mechanics of the car work. So we move through this when we're learning new material, and there's some danger zones here. Learning is happening between the conscious incompetence and the conscious competence. And this is a place where we really want individuals to pay attention to the messages they're telling themselves and the way that they're feeling. And this is where we often see people give up, drop out, or start to feel like they can't accomplish this goal that they want to. So as a tutor, it's your role to just recognize that there is a pathway by which students are moving from conscious incompetence to conscious competence, and to recognize that that doesn't always happen as quickly as we'd like it to. So again, you're not trying to push the student to move faster to any particular place, but just to recognize that we're on different we're on different places in that pathway as we move through a structured course, and to honor where that student is, give them the tools that they need, which we'll talk about next, to move forward into that conscious competence place. So this is just a brief overview of 2 different tools that you can use to assess where the student's at personally, so that's that hierarchy of needs, and then as far as learning goes, where are they at with the learning? And then the second tool for assessment that we're going to discuss is called Bloom's taxonomy, and this is a really important tool. Benjamin Bloom was an early educational theorist who came up with this order of understanding, and it starts down at the bottom with remembering and works its way up to creating. So when we are just trying to recall basic facts and concepts, we're at the remembering level. And then we move up from there. And I'm not going to go through each one of these in detail, but I'd like you to pause the slide and look at the differences among each one of these levels of understanding. Each one also has verbs in italices below it, and these verbs are really important as a tutor because these are the kind of words that you want to use when you are challenging students to become better critical thinkers. And so you might use these to help them develop practice test questions, or when they're working in small groups together. These might be verbs that help them to understand the material at a higher level. Now, when you were in high school, you really only needed to be at the remembering level in order to earn A grades. It was just definitions and facts. But as you move into your freshman, sophomore year of college, or if you're at a community college, we expect you to be in understanding and some applying. And then once you get into your junior and senior years, we really expect you to be in applying and analyzing. And then graduate school is about evaluating, and PhD students are creating new knowledge as they do research. So although each one of these levels is building upon itself, or I should say that although each one of these levels is distinct, they do build upon themselves. So you can't be at the evaluating level without having also spent time down at the remembering level. So this is important because when you're sitting down with a student, whether it's one-on-one or you're working with a group, you're trying to assess, where are they challenging themselves? Are they writing flashcard questions that's down in remembering and understanding? Well, that's okay, as long as they are also writing flashcard questions that are in applying and analyzing. If they're just operating down in remembering and understanding, they're not challenging themselves to develop those critical thinking skills, and they also won't be successful on their tests, because our tests are going to be asking them questions all the way up through analyzing if they're in 300 and 400 level courses. So this is a really important tool as a tutor. Now, how does a student move from one level to the next? And the best way to talk about that is about metacognition, and that's the next slide. So metacognition is basically defined as thinking about how you're thinking. Meta means many or about, and cognition is thinking. So you're really just thinking about how you're thinking. It's asking yourself really good questions that are assessing what you know and how effective you are, and connecting different ideas, and challenging yourself to work through problems. What I'd like you to do as we move through the next few exercises and slides is to take off your tutor training hat for just a minute and focus on your life as a student. And once you sort of think about these strategies and how you would use them as a student, then you can start to think about how you would use them and bring them into the tutoring environment. But I think it's important to understand what the metacognitive strategies are that help a student to move up through Bloom's taxonomy from your own lens. And then you can talk about how that might apply to your work as a tutor. I think it can be a bit cerebral to try and understand what metacognition really is. So I have an activity that I want you to do that will help to explain it. What I'm going to do is I am going to show you the next slide, and I'm going to ask you to count all the vowels. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to count all the vowels on the next slide. And we're going to start, right? So no pens or pencils for this. You're just counting the vowels on your screen. Ready? And go. Okay, now jot down how many vowels you counted. Now you would guess that I would next tell you how many vowels there were in that slide, and you'd see how accurate you were. But that's not what I'm going to do. Instead, I am going to ask you, how many words do you remember from that slide? So go ahead and take the next 20 seconds and jot down as many words as you can remember from that slide. Okay, so if you're like most people, you probably don't have very many words on your sheet of paper. You were really busy counting the vowels, and so you weren't paying attention to the words. So I'm going to show you the words again. I want you to keep your pencil down. We're just using your mind for this. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds, and I want you to see how many words you can remember, and pay special attention to how the words are arranged. Ready? And go. Okay, now take the next 30 seconds and write down as many words from that list as you can remember. Go ahead and do that now. All right, now I'm curious to know how many words you remember. You may have noticed that the words in the slide were in an order. The dollar bill is a 1, represents a 1. Dice represents 2. Tricycle represents 3, etc. You can see we go all the way down to a quarter hour, which represents 15 minutes or 15. So there are 15 words in this list. And usually when I do this exercise with students, we find that they remember many of the words, usually more than 10 on the second attempt, and usually none of the words, if not 1 or 2 on the first attempt. So what was different? What did you do differently? Well, the first time you were just searching for something. You were just trying to find what I told you to find. You weren't really trying to look at the relationships between the words and see the bigger picture. The other thing that was different is that you were creating order and relationship among unrelated things the second time. The first time you were just looking for that one thing. So how does this explain what metacognition is? If you were to receive a study guide and you had a number of questions that you needed to work through on that study guide, and all you did was find the answers to those questions in your studying, that's like searching for the vowels. You're just looking for what you were told you were supposed to know, you're trying to memorize it and know it, and that's it. Where if you receive a study guide and you use it as a guide to help you learn how these different ideas are connected, how they're similar, how they're different, what more you want to know about them, you're actually creating a deeper level of knowledge. You're moving up on Bloom's taxonomy. So this is an example of what metacognition looks like when you're trying to create order and relationship, and that instead of just looking for what you know you're supposed to find, you're looking for what you need to understand. This is where I want you to pull up the case study. There's 3 different case studies that are made available in the folder on Blackboard where this slideshow was stored. And I'd like you to choose one of the 3 case studies, doesn't matter which one, whichever one you're most comfortable with, and read it, and then review these 3 questions. And then I'd like you to take a moment to type out your responses to these 3 questions to that case study. And you'll do this again as we near the end of the recording where you're applying what we've learned to a case study. I would, and then I'll ask you to send that to me once we're all done. That'll be how you complete this requirement for training. So choose a case study and then ask yourself the questions. In what ways did the tutor act as a coach and provide scaffolding? Or what ways did they not that you think they could have? And then how did the tutor provide structure, or how did they not provide structure, and what would you have done differently? And then where do you think this student or this group would fall on Bloom's taxonomy or on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? And this question can be hard to answer because there's not often a lot of information. So if you try to question, what do I know, or what can I assume based on what's here? But if there's not much for Bloom's or Maslow's for that assessment piece, ask yourself or respond to this with questions that you could have asked the student, or what you would want to know more about in order to make that assessment. So I hope that makes sense. I'm flexible with these questions, so just respond in a way that makes the most sense for you. And go ahead and pause this recording now so that you can do that. Okay, now we're going to move into what metacognitive strategies look like. So we did a quick exercise to talk about what metacognition is. We talked about Bloom's taxonomy and how we move through different levels of understanding. Metacognitive strategies help us to move up those levels of understanding. They help us to create better critical thinking skills. And there's a lot of different metacognitive strategies out there. And I'm just going to go through, it's actually 3 of them. I know I mentioned earlier it was 4, but there's just 3 as part of this training. So I'm going to go through those 3 with you, and there are some other ones that are on our website. There's some tools that are loaded into Blackboard for you, and you can always contact me for more information about this. But these are the 3 strategies that I've seen be the most useful for students as they needed to make those transitions to higher levels of learning. The first one is called dual coding, and what it's called, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, you don't have to remember what it's called, just as long as you can remember the activity. And dual coding is about comparing images and words and then challenging yourself to be able to retrieve them on your own. So how you do this is you have a graph, and then you have some words that describe that graph or that concept. And you compare them and look them over and try to create an understanding of what you're looking at. And then you remove the text, the written part of that, and you're just looking at the visual, and you try to write out in your own words what that visual is explaining or what that concept is about. And you might have to look back at your references a few times, but you're trying to work your way up to doing this without looking at the reference. So you have the visual in front of you and you're creating the text piece. And students do this by, using the snipping tool through a PowerPoint slide and just covering up what they don't know, or they'll just take if it's in a textbook, they might take a blank piece of paper, cover up what they don't know. But you're trying to recreate those words. And then the next thing you do is the opposite. So then you remove the words, you remove the visual and you have the words, and you're trying to recreate that visual. So you might be drawing out a graph or chart or a table, but you're trying to recreate that from your own mind with just the words available. And you might have to do this a few times or switch back and forth a few times, but the goal is that eventually you're coming up to a place where you can create both the words and the visual entirely from memory. So in the beginning it's hard, but you work your way up to feeling confident. Sometimes students will then use that information to create other visuals that organize the information for them. Some examples on the screen here are a graphic organizer, or otherwise known as a mind map. You might see a diagram or an infographic. Lots of different ways that you can do this, and you can get creative. But if you are creating it from memory, then you know that you know it. So this is a great way, a great strategy for learning material that has a visual component to it. The second metacognitive strategy that I'm going to share today is called elaboration, and it's exactly how it sounds. It's about asking yourself good and powerful questions about a topic and then talking to it about others, and then letting that lead down the road of additional questioning. So this is a great tool to be using when you're in a group, a small group, or even a dyad. So you're asking questions that start with words like what, how, tell me, what if. So this is not the kind of thing that you see in maybe a basic study guide, but you might take a question that's in a study guide and then expand upon it or elaborate upon it using those questions. And then you compare, how are things similar, how are they different? You may draw it out or write it out, and then you talk to your classmates about it. So we know that we know something if we can teach it. And that's why elaboration is such a great metacognitive tool. Is if you've ever been in a situation where you thought you knew something really well, and then you go to explain it to somebody else and realize that, hey, I don't really know this as well as I thought I did, that's a good cue that you need to spend some more time with the information. And elaboration is a great way to check how well you know what you think you know. And then the last metacognitive strategy that we're going to talk about during this recording is called retrieval practice. And this is one of the last strategies that we use. It's really a checking strategy. It's a how well do I know this? I've been drawing it, I've been writing about it, I've been interacting with it, I've been practicing, I've been talking about it, but now how well do I really know it? Retrieval practice is usually things like flashcards or practice tests. Practice tests are one of the best ways to increase test scores. We have plenty of research that indicates that test scores will practice tests will increase test scores more than any other study strategy. So I encourage students to take the practice tests that might be in their textbooks or available online. If those aren't available, get together with a group and everybody creates 5 or 10 test questions, and then you exchange them with one another. The really important thing to remember about that is that your group or your students are creating test questions that cover all of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy that are relevant given the class they're in. So think about if they are if they're in a 300 level course, we'd want them to be working at least the analyzing level. And so be sure that the questions that they are creating cover all the way from remembering up to analyzing. And you can use the verbs that are available on that Bloom's handout to be sure that those questions really are challenging the student at the right level. So practice testing is a great retrieval practice strategy. Another one is flashcards. Flashcards are excellent. The only thing to be careful of with flashcards, if you see students using them or if you use them yourself, is that you've got the flashcard in front of you and the question or the concept is written on one side, and what I see students doing is looking at that side and then flipping it over and verifying the answer on the back and then moving to the next card. And that's not actually retrieval practice. What that is recognition practice. So if you think of recognition as a multiple choice question where all the answers are in front of you and you just have to find the right one, you have to recognize the right one, where retrieval practice is like a fill in the blank, where you have to retrieve it out of your memory, you have to know it. And so when a student is using flashcards, you want to be sure that they aren't flipping the card over until they have vocalized or internally covered or answered the question or the concept that's on the front of the card. And then they can turn it over to verify that it's correct. So it's how you interact with that tool. A lot of people use flashcards, but it's how you interact with the tool that makes it a metacognitive strategy. And then I also think it's important to remind students that retrieval practice is really hard. This is something that's exhausting and sometimes frustrating, and sometimes you expose yourself to something multiple times and it's just not sticking. And this is the end point in verifying your learning. And so you've already invested a lot of time and energy once you get to retrieval practice, and if you're not getting the results that you would have expected, that can be really hard. So just to give yourself some grace and to give your students some grace if they're struggling with this, and just a reminder to keep using the strategies and remember that it takes time to learn new things. Those are the 3 metacognitive strategies that we're going to cover in this session. So if you want more, please come and see me, but there's a good start for some tools that you can use with students. And then the last tool in your toolbox, so we talked about structuring tutoring, we talked about assessing where the student's at, and we talked about metacognitive strategies. And then the last tool, which I think is your most important tool, is the Socratic method, or your questioning tool. I want you to think about this because here's an example of why this works. You're sitting in class, just imagine this, you're sitting in class and your instructor covers a topic during a lecture and you pay attention and you take notes. And then you leave and you're an expert on the topic. You know all about it. Not really, right? That's not really how it works. You have to then ask yourself questions about it. You have to interact with it with other material. You have to talk to people about it. All the things we've been talking about, you have to do in order to become knowledgeable about the topic. It's not simply that lecture of the expert giving the knowledge to the learner that makes the learner automatically understand it. So that's where Socratic questioning comes into place. Socrates, many of you are already aware, was a philosopher many millennia ago, and he had a method for teaching, which was a sort of dialogue based on asking questions to stimulate critical thinking. And I have a specific way that I recommend that tutors do this. I call them back pocket questions. Questions that I always keep in my back pocket. And if you ever meet with me one-on-one, you'll hear me ask you a lot of questions that start with these words. What, how, and tell me. What else can you tell me about that concept? How does it work when you throw in this additional variable? Tell me more about pharmacology as related to this disease. So if you can get used to having these 3 words in your back pocket, we call them stems because they just are the beginning of the question. What, how, and tell me. You're leading the student to research the information, talk to their peers about it. They're also giving you an indication of what they know and what they don't know, which helps you assess as a tutor how much information you need to provide. The Socratic method, you're questioning. The questions that you ask as a tutor is so much more important than the information you provide. Yes, at times you will pull out the resource and you will help to provide direct information about a particular topic. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. But just like in the lecture example I gave you a minute ago, that's not how the student is necessarily learning the material, especially long term. They might in the moment understand what you say and nod their head and say, oh yes, awesome, I get it. That's how it works. But if you ask them a question, like, okay, so I've explained this concept to you. Now, what would be a good example of how this might play out in a real life scenario? You're getting them to critically assess it and apply it. So that's moving that up Bloom's taxonomy and deepening their knowledge. So again, I just want to reiterate that questioning is the most important thing that you do as a tutor. It's so much more important than the direct information you provide. You need that content knowledge so that you can direct the student to the correct information, but just giving them the information doesn't actually help the individual to learn near as well as does great questioning techniques. If you want help with this, please come and talk to me and we can practice. Okay, next I'm going to show a video because I think that picture's worth 1,000 words, and it can be a little bit difficult to understand how the Socratic method might play out in a real life tutoring session. So I'm going to play this video. I think it's 3 minutes, and it is a tutor, a writing tutor, and a student who are working through a paper together, and the tutor is using the Socratic questioning technique to help guide the student. So pay attention to the questions that she's asking and how she's guiding the student. And I know that this is writing, which is different from the health sciences, but I think you'll get the idea. Okay, so a couple of things to mention about that video. And again, I know it was writing, so it's different, but I think you can get the idea that she spent 75% of her time, the tutor, asking questions. And you'd think that if you were just asking questions that it would be awkward or feel weird or interrogatory, but you can see that that did flow pretty naturally, and the student did seem to receive the questions well, respond, and be understanding what she needed to do by just guiding with the questions. The other thing that I think is important to point out is that when you're using questioning techniques, you have to become comfortable with silence. And this tutor did a nice job of asking a question that was guiding the student to improve her writing, and then providing silence so that the student could think through their response and respond in the way they needed to. So again, good questioning techniques and allowing for silence are important in using the Socratic method. I just have one slide to talk about test preparation and managing test anxiety. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't something that we expect for you to be an expert in by any means, but it will come up. And so I'm going to give you just a few tools and ideas to consider, and then be sure to refer students over to me if they need additional support here. There is a handout that was in the same folder as this PowerPoint slide that is called Test Preparation and Test Anxiety. So that handout would be a good one for you to have, and it goes over this in a little bit more detailed manner. I like to think about test preparation as a cyclical process. Instead of it just being you cram for the test, you take the test, and it's over, really test preparation is a whole cycle in which you are interacting with material and assessing your performance. And if you start to view it that way, then you start to become better at test taking and more confident in your test taking skills. So briefly, let's go over the 4 stages of test preparation. The first thing, the number one thing an individual can do to reduce test anxiety is to over-prepare. So we're talking about pre-testing right now, this upper left quadrant of the circle. This is before you take the test. You're just getting ready for it. We know that spaced practice is more effective in learning material. So instead of spending 4 hours studying for a test the day before, you will actually learn the material better if you study for 1 hour a day for 4 days before. So spacing out your study time increases retention. So over-prepare, but don't cram it all. You space it out. And one thing that's really key to that is getting enough sleep. Sleeping is learning. You are processing and moving information that you learned that day into memory storage. So be sure that you or the student are getting adequate sleep. Taking good care of yourself, getting activity, being outside. If someone is really struggling with test anxiety, I recommend that they practice relaxation techniques. And I have some of those available in the office and on our website. You can also work with a counselor, which is available in the Student Success Center, to help practice or learn relaxation techniques. But the key is that if you practice this when you are not stressed out, that once you get into the test environment, if you find that you're anxious, you can then tap into that skill that you've already learned how to use and calm yourself so that you can perform. So then you come to test day. So that's pre-test. You're spacing your study, you're using metacognitive strategies, you're telling yourself positive things, you're practicing relaxing, and you're getting adequate sleep. That's what you're doing to prepare for a test. And then on test day, here's what I recommend. Plan to be early, maybe an hour early, a half hour at minimum, because things happen. Cars break down, something, you got a coffee spills on you. There's all kinds of things that just happen. There's an unexpected traffic jam, or you miss your bus. So spending some time preparing to be early is definitely worthwhile in case anything goes wrong, because that will just increase your anxiety if you feel you're going to be late. Ask yourself, what tools do I need for this test, and be sure you're bringing the correct tools. Be sure to dress in layers. There's nothing worse than being super hot or super cold and trying to perform. Make sure that you adequately hydrated yourself. So if you're drinking coffee in the morning, fine, but be sure that you drink plenty of water. Your brain functions best when it's really well hydrated. The brain is like 80% water, so it needs to be hydrated to perform well. And then be sure that you've given your body food. So your brain needs glucose in order to function well. So you're hydrated, and then you've also given your brain a meal, or if your stomach's upset from getting ready to take a test, maybe some Gatorade or something that will give your brain the energy it needs to perform. So that's test day. Then of course you're taking the test. Here are specific strategies for interacting with the test, and many of you already know these because we learned them when we were younger. First things first, you review the whole test. Is it two-sided or one-sided if it's on a piece of paper? If you have it on, if it's electronic, as much as you can review the whole test, as much as you're allowed to. How many pages are there? How many questions? If you can interact with it, if it's a paper test or this tool is available online, underline any qualifying words like all, but, except. These are words that skip people or get people all the time on tests because they miss them because they're anxious or they're rushing through. And then you answer what you know first. So if the test allows you, and some of the newer online test platforms are not as user-friendly as a piece of paper where you can flip through, but answer what you know first if you can, and then use the time that you have available to go back and respond to the things that you weren't sure about. Make sure that you're managing your mindset and using those relaxation techniques during the test. So you've practiced the relaxation techniques so you know how to use them, and it's easy for you to take 2 minutes to calm yourself so that you can perform better. Trust me, those 2 minutes that you use will save you 10 minutes of anxiety and worry. And then be sure to review the entire exam before you turn it in. Make sure you didn't miss anything. As far as changing answers goes, here is what I recommend. Only change an answer if, one, you are 100% confident that you circled the wrong thing, so it was just a mistake or you misread the question, or two, you learned something as you were working through the test, or you were cued to remember something as you were working through the test that now changes how you would respond to that former question. Okay? So then you relax. You're all done with your test, and then you get the grade back. Most important thing to remember is that a test grade is not a personal assessment. It's not how smart you are. It's not whether you were a good person or not, or whether you put in enough time. It's just an assessment of how well you did on that test. Sometimes tests don't even tell us exactly how well we know material. It's just how well you studied what happened to be on that test. So try to separate it from your sense of self. Even if it's a low score, it doesn't mean that you are not a worthwhile and good, hardworking person. Then look at the test through an unbiased lens. What were the wins? What were the things you did really well? What were the things that you didn't do so well on? Where did you make silly errors? And then identify trends. Did you do better on the first half of the test than the second half of the test? Did you do better on a certain type of question, like maybe multiple choice versus fill in the blank? Or did you do better in a particular topic area where you maybe spent more time, or where you maybe interacted with the material in a different way? So make note of trends and then make a plan. What can you learn from how you performed on this test, and how can you change what you're doing so that you can perform better on the next one? If you just take the test, look at your score, take the feelings that come from that score, and just start again with the next test, you're not really growing or learning from that experience. An exam is an assessment tool that you can learn and grow from. Ignoring what happened on the test and just moving forward is such a grand loss. So take that information and do something with it that makes a difference for you. Okay, briefly, I want to go over a few things. We're starting to wind this recording down. I want to talk to you about a few things that are important for you to be looking out for when you're working with students, either one-on-one. You probably see these things most often one-on-one, but it can come up in groups. So when tutoring isn't enough, in any of these situations, or any other situation that we don't mention here where you might feel uncomfortable or not sure what to do, always consult with either Laura Winterstein, Jane, or me. And don't delay. Do it right away, right after the session, so that we know that we have connected that student with any resources they may need. Here are some examples. The student is understanding the concepts when you're working together, and you feel confident that they're going to be able to perform well, and so does the student. But then they perform poorly on the exam, and they tell you, yeah, when I sat down, everything was gone. I just went totally blank. So that's a sign that there's something else going on cognitively, and we'd like to help that student, so refer them into us. Or a student tells you that he's experiencing a personal trauma and he just can't focus on his learning. You don't necessarily need to ask about the trauma. If they offer up that information, that's fine, but you really are just trying to connect them with resources. So talk with Jane or Laura or I. A student tells you that they've always struggled with a particular type of learning, or that they received extra help in high school. Those are usually keywords, extra help in high school, that they might need some accommodation support here at the college level. Maybe they didn't know that was available. So that would be a good reason to refer. And then a student might express financial trouble or food shortage. We have resources available to help students with those situations, so please refer. And then if a student ever mentions to you that they feel unsafe for any reason, whether it's stalking, harassment, or something else, please refer them to us and tell us about it so that we can reach out to the student. Okay, go ahead and pull out that case study that you worked on earlier. And what I'd like you to do is, you can use the same case study, you can use a different one if you'd like, but I'd like you to look over these 4 questions and then respond to them, type them out, and send this to me along with the responses to the first questions. So you're asking yourself now, when you're reading the case study, how could you bring metacognitive strategies into this tutoring scenario? How would you do that? And what strategies would you bring in? Then what are 2 Socratic style questions that you could ask given the scenario that you have? Did you see any missed opportunities in this scenario? And what would you do differently if you were the tutor in this situation? So take a few minutes and respond to these questions, type it out, and send it to me. I'm going to move through the last 3 slides really quickly. They're just summary slides. So if you would like to work on the case study now, go ahead and pause the PowerPoint. All right, just revisiting what we've gone over today. We talked in the beginning about your role as a tutor, which is different than that of a teacher. We talked about specific skills for tutoring, how to structure the session, assessing where the student's at, bringing in strategies and good questioning, and then we talked about the cycle of test preparation and managing test anxiety. And then you had an opportunity to work with a case study and practice applying some of these skills. If you have any questions, please contact me. The Blackboard course where you found this recording also has a number of other resources available for tutors, so please use those. If you would like to make an appointment with me to talk about your learning, you can do that at the link on this screen, the My WC Online. And I also encourage all students to follow us on Facebook. I try to post some kind of learning or career related tip or video at least once a week. You can see that link is there as well. And then the last thing I would like to ask that you do is take 5 minutes to answer a few questions about this training and how it was useful, or maybe how it could be improved. If you have Snapchat, you can scan the code that you see on your screen here, and it will take you right to the survey. If you don't have Snapchat or you can't get the code to scan, the link that you see right below it will also take you right to that survey. And it's just, it's short. I think it's 10 questions, and the feedback is really helpful to me. I do update these regularly based on the feedback that I receive. So thank you for listening and for interacting with the material. Please reach out to me if there's any questions I can answer. Thanks a lot.